You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
I know the most riveting subject on the face of the earth is monetary and tax policy, and I say that without sarcasm. I actually find that riveting. And even if you don't like getting into the weeds on economics and the way that the government taxes you, it is certainly relevant when you learn exactly how much you're being taxed. A new Fraser Institute study says the average Canadian family spent 42.6% of its income on taxes annually in 2020. That's more than housing, food, and clothing combined. This is an annual report that the Fraser Institute does, but even so, I mean, it tells a very stark portrait every single year. Jake Fuss is an economist at the Fraser Institute and co-author of this year's study, the Canadian Consumer Tax Index 2020. Jake, good to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on today.
Thanks very much for having me on, Andrew.
So let's talk about the number here, because a lot of people, when they think of how much they're getting taxed, I don't think they look at it all in one basket. They'll think, okay, my income tax rate is X, or my property taxes are this many dollars. And when you combine it all, is that where we're getting that 42.6% figure from?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it can be extremely challenging for families to calculate all the various taxes they pay. We have things like sales taxes, income taxes, property taxes, liquor taxes, fuel taxes, and the list goes on. So what we try to do every year is tabulate all these different taxes that the average family pays. And then what we come to is that the average family actually pays about almost $39,000 in taxes every year. And that's almost 43% of their annual income. And like you said, that's more than the basic necessities of food, clothing, and housing combined. So it's quite a substantial expense.
Is the result that you get from that simply that the number is too high, or is there going to be a target in mind that you think that number should be at?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Ultimately, it is up to individual Canadians to decide if they're getting value for their tax dollars. But what we do see is that we're uncompetitive with other OECD countries, particularly the United States, on things like personal income tax rates. So we're uncompetitive at the levels like $50,000, $75,000, and $150,000 of income. So we're kind of uncompetitive across the board on personal income tax rates in particular. And then we also see a declining competitiveness on corporate income tax rates as well with the United States. So these are certainly drags on economic growth and productivity in Canada, and that can certainly be harmful. We are seeing that tax rate increase over time in Canada, and we are becoming less competitive with other countries around the world.
And just to take it out of the percentage realm and put it in dollar figures, the average family, according to this index, earned $91,535 last year, and of that paid $38,963 in taxes. So if someone just kind of takes that figure and digests it a bit, that's nearly $40,000 paid to the government. And I don't want to say it's for nothing, because yes, there are services that people avail themselves out of, but did you get $40,000 out of value from the government as a family last year would be the question I'd ask a lot of people, and I'm not sure the answer is going to be yes.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately that decision is up to each person. They can, weigh how much they get in services and the quality of services versus how much they're actually paying. But what we do see is, just because you're spending a whole bunch of money doesn't necessarily mean that it's the most effective or efficient way to do that. There is plenty of potential for government waste. There can be handouts to corporations at the expense of taxpayers. What we're seeing, healthcare spending has increased a lot over time, but we're not necessarily seeing wait times come down. In fact, Canada actually performs quite poorly compared to other universal healthcare countries around the world on wait times and on number of doctors and hospital beds and other categories like that. So just because you're spending a whole bunch of money doesn't necessarily mean you're getting best results. But ultimately, it is up to people to decide if they're getting good value for those tax dollars.
I know you mentioned the comparison between Canada and other OECD countries. How has the track been in Canada historically? Is this number staying relatively constant? Are we seeing it going up, or dare I say even down?
Yeah, so for the tax rates for Canada, so we go back all the way to 1961 in our report. That's when the data was first available from Statistics Canada. And what we saw at that time is that the tax rate was at about 33.5% for the average family back in 1961. And basic necessities actually amounted to over half of your income for the average family. But that's remarkably shift over time now. So now we see basic necessities taking up about a third of your income at about 36%, whereas the tax rate now is at about 42.6% for average families. So the tax rate has generally been increasing over time. So that has been a remarkable shift that we've seen. Particularly in recent years, we've seen things like payroll taxes and the elimination of certain tax credits, and that's certainly increased the tax rate for average Canadian families. And that's something that we'll keep our eye on moving forward as well.
And you mentioned tax credits. These credits are historically factored into these numbers, because I know that can make it, in many cases, even more complicated to try to calculate.
Yeah, tax rates, tax credits, things like that, they're all incorporated into our calculation. Like I said, we have a whole bunch of different categories like income tax rates, corporate income tax rates, property taxes, and so on. So we do calculate, various things into those calculations every year.
I know there have been a number of policies in the last few years that have forced there to be more transparency on credit card bills, on phone bills, on hydro bills. A part of me thinks when I look at this, the Canadians could benefit from a breakdown of exactly how much they're spending in taxes every time they do something, because certainly it seems like, just given the total sum here, the individual places where people are being taxed would probably shock a lot of people.
Yeah, and that's ultimately what this report aims to do. I mean, when we look at housing costs, for example, we look at that in the study, amounts to about $20,000 per year, or about 22% of your annual income for the average family. But when you actually consider how much taxes amount to, it's nearly double what actually is in housing. So, as a lot of Canadians are concerned about paying their rent or paying their mortgage right now, they should also consider, how much they're actually paying in taxes. It's the single largest expense for Canadian families right now, and that's certainly a big consideration for them when they're considering their budgets every year.
What are the areas, if any, where people might not realize they're getting taxed, or where the number might be higher? Because I know that I mentioned at the top of the interview here, your personal income tax, your sales tax. I mean, these are things that people see a lot more. You must be factoring some numbers here that people might not realize are there, or might not realize are as high as they are.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a couple of things here. Corporate income tax rates is not something that people necessarily think of being taxed to themselves. And same with payroll taxes. But what we actually see with corporate income taxes and payroll taxes is that a lot of this, the burden is actually passed on to employees in the form of lower wages. So it's not necessarily something that people will think of. They think it's kind of just a burden on the employer, for example. But we do see that there are results for lower wages for employees. And it can also have higher unemployment effects as well, because you're increasing the costs for businesses and they're going to pass on that cost to employees. So that's something that we see out in the empirical research, that this can be passed on to employees, and it usually is.
I know predictions are always tough, especially when you're talking about a study that's really data focused. But when you do this for 2020, looking at some of the changes that we've seen in the economy this year, do you think when you do the next version, looking back, it's going to be a bit more challenging, just given all of the factors that I think Canadian families are dealing with job losses?
Certainly. I mean, one thing that we're thinking about going forward, is right now we're running a federal deficit of about $343 billion. So we're having a lot of today's spending that's not necessarily being financed by today's taxes. So we're likely to see deferred taxation into the future, where tax rates are likely to increase in the future. So going forward, we could actually see the tax rates in this study start to increase more, and we could see a lot more challenges for Canadian families moving forward as well, as we start to have that tax bill start to increase.
Yeah, and I just have to clarify, I think at the beginning I may have messed up the year. The study is 2020. The data in the study are from 2019. So obviously you're looking back to the data that are available, given this year's aren't in yet. So I just wanted to clarify that for those listening. And I do think, to the point that you just brought up, a lot of the concerns that we may see if people are finding that, yes, their job losses are happening and income's going down, that the percentage people are spending on taxes, even if the dollar figure isn't higher, may actually be quite significantly inflated. So perhaps there's going to be a bit more awareness when we look at these numbers.
Yeah, that's certainly an important consideration. Ultimately, this study is about informing Canadians of how much their tax bill is. And, it has increased by over 2,000% since 1961. Even when we account for inflation, it's about 169% increase. But ultimately, that percentage of income number is probably the most important one. Just seeing that general increase over time, where we were at about 34% of income back in the 60s, and we're now at about 43% of income. And this is likely to increase as well in the future. So that's certainly an important number that I think Canadians will be informed of.
Jake Fuss, economist with the Fraser Institute, joining me on the line now. The report, the Canadian Consumer Tax Index 2020. Jake, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much for having me on, Andrew.
Like I said earlier, I know nothing is as riveting as talking about tax policy, but there is a significant question there. Anytime you're spending more for something, you have to ask, are you getting that much more value out of it? And when he said that's gone up 2,000% over the 1960s, I don't know how many of you listening were around in the 60s, but if you were, are you getting 2,000% more value from government now than you were then? And you especially see this on property taxes, because property tax bills will go up consistently in most cities every year. And maybe it's a couple of percent here and there, but it's like, well, hang on, you're not picking up my garbage 2% faster. You're not picking up my recycling 2% faster. I know recycling's a bit different, but you're not doing any of these things better. You're not giving me 2% more services. You're just paying more. And in many cases with property taxes, you're getting a tax rate increase. And also if the value of your home is going up, you're actually paying more for that reason as well. Same as inflation. If the price of a widget goes up by a few percent, your 13% or 5% or 8% sales tax is actually going up as well. And a lot of the time, people do not realize just how buried a lot of these taxes are. If you do any air travel or anything like that, you're paying taxes on taxes, or gas, you're paying taxes on taxes a lot of the time, and it is absolutely insane. So these reports are good. Transparency is key. And again, I know that Aaron O'Toole has just taken the helm of the Conservative Party of Canada, but it would be great if he could actually take this seriously and start promising not just a reduction in taxes, but a simplification and streamlining of them. That's my wish for the Conservative leader or any political leader moving forward. I just don't think it's going to come from the Liberals. My thanks again to Jake Fuss and to all of you for tuning in to the Andrew Lawton Show. We've got to wrap things up, but we will be back next week with more of Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is the Andrew Lawton Show on True North. Thank you, God bless, and good day, Canada.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.